Evolution, a deliberate yet subliminal process for all but humankind. We cannot wait.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
He's on the move.
Coming up, university scientists are using a DNA marking technique to help stop the decline of the bumblebee in Britain. In 2001, experts were predicting that the United Kingdom would produce more than 2,000 megawatts of wind energy by the end of 2005, meeting about 1.6% of Britain's electricity demands. Houston, we have a problem. 4 words that brought the world to a standstill as 1 billion people shared the anguish of space engineers as they strive to bring 3 astronauts safely back to Earth from their crippled Apollo 13 spacecraft. The numbers of bees, vital in cross-pollinating crops, have been falling for many years. It's thought at least 4 of the 19 species of the British bumblebee are now extinct. The bees are vital to the agricultural environment. They are pollinators of both wildflowers and commercial crops, particularly tomatoes and strawberries. Their falling numbers are blamed on modern farming methods, the increased use of pesticides, and the loss of hedgerows in recent years. Scientists at Southampton University in southern England are using a DNA fingerprinting technique to mark and match some 300 bees from different farm sites. They're trying to work out the density of bumblebee population so as to compare different farming regimes and different ways of managing the countryside to see which one is best for bees. By identifying which bees are worker bees and where they come from, the scientists can work out what areas and conditions are the best for them to increase their numbers again. If they can work out which habitats are good for them, they can provide advisors on how to manage farmland and to encourage bee numbers. Agricultural firms regard the pilot project as vital. One tomato plant company has had to import bumblebees from Holland because of the lack of local species. On the UK's eastern coast, one lone wind turbine stands next door to a family of 10. Built nearly 10 years apart, these 2 separate wind farms represent the progress made in wind power technology over the past decade, as well as Britain's growing commitment to this source of power. And Nick Goodall, the chief executive of the British Wind Energy Association, says the trend will continue as Britain builds for a future with a clean, green and sustainable fuel. Britain currently produces enough wind energy to power more than 250,000 homes. The price of wind energy continues to fall. Incredible though it sounds, it's already as cheap as most forms of technology. That means that the projects can be moved to places that might not be quite as windy as those original sites, but it doesn't necessarily mean they'll be more expensive. Britain is one of Europe's windiest places. Offshore wind power should play a significant part in government plans to produce 10% of the country's energy from renewable sources by 2010.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
April the 13th, 1970. And the mood of space engineers at NASA's Houston Control Center could only be described as relaxed. The Apollo 13 mission had successfully hurtled into space from Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center at 2:13 p.m. on April the 11th. and now the flight was going as planned, with astronauts James A. Lovell Jr., the commander, John L. Swigert Jr., the command module pilot, and Fred W. Hayes Jr., lunar module pilot, entertaining the ground crew with the observation that it was rather odd to be floating in their space capsule whilst listening to the theme music from 2001, played by a tiny tape recorder the trio had carried into space. Amidst the routine instructions, Jack Loosma, at the time heading the ground crew, calls on Swigert to stir up the cryotanks, a reference to the cryogenic oxygen tanks. Nothing appears to be unduly abnormal. Swigert responds, "Okay, stand by." Suddenly, Swigert utters those fateful words, "Houston, we have a problem." Words that would eventually bring the American nation and most of the world to a standstill. Instantly, the ground crew become fully alert as Loosma replies, "Stand by 13, we're looking at it." Back to April the 11th, launch day. Preparations for the flight had gone to plan. Commander of the crew, Jim Lovell, a veteran of 3 previous missions. He'd orbited the moon at Christmas 1968 aboard Apollo 8. For lunar module pilot Fred Hayes, this was his first time up. Jack Swigert, command module pilot, 3 days before he was on the backup crew, but now replaced Ken Mattingly. Mattingly was dropped from the mission because he'd been exposed to German measles. He would watch the launch from Houston's mission control. The Apollo 13 mission was planned as a lunar landing mission, and the spacecraft was made up of the same components as all Apollo landing missions, consisting of the 2-part command service module, Odyssey, and the 2-part lunar module, Aquarius. As the result of the accident, however, none of these components was used in precisely the way they were originally intended.
Clock start, flight. Roger.
Let's go, all engines.
Roger. Okay, final, how's it look?
Looks good here, flight. Good agreement.
Okay, Booster, how do you look?
That's once he looks good, flight.
Okay, Capcom, we go you on the ground.
The launch proceeded smoothly, with Mattingly obviously having mixed feelings as he watched the swift ascent. On the one hand, delighted that his colleagues were safely on their way, whilst on the other, a deep disappointment that he wasn't an integral part of the action. During the launch, the second stage inboard engine shut down early because of high amplitude longitudinal oscillations. However, near nominal trajectory parameters were achieved at orbital insertion. The Earth orbital and translunar injection phases went as planned. Intended as the 3rd lunar landing mission, Apollo 13 had a full roster of activities scheduled in addition to lunar surfaces activities such as experiments, sampling and photography. The photographic objectives of Apollo 13 were to obtain vertical and oblique stereo strips of lunar regions of scientific interest and to obtain photographs of the lunar and command service modules. But first, Apollo 13 was required to burn out of Earth orbit toward the moon, then fall free of the 3rd stage and dock with the lunar module Aquarius. At the controls of the command module, Odyssey, Jack Swigert advises Houston Control that he has hard docked the craft. Aquarius is pulled away from the Saturn 3rd stage, the S-4B, and a relieved Swigert confirms he has a visual sight of the rocket, and Odyssey and Aquarius are now on their way toward the moon. At 55 hours, 53 minutes and 18 seconds into the mission, Swigert's words, "Okay, Houston, we have a problem," shattered the calm at the Houston Control Center. Technicians quickly began to assess what they could learn from their telemetry. Oxygen tank number 1, fans on. Oxygen tank number 2, pressure decreases 8 psi. Stabilization control system. Electrical disturbance indicates a power transient. Swigert reports hearing a pretty large bang.
Pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning.
Is there any
Oxygen tank number 2, pressure decreases.
we got a real problem or what?
11.1 amprise in fuel cell 3.
And 13 psi on fuel cell 3 O2 pressure.
Oxygen tank number 2, quantity drops from full scale for 2 seconds and then reads 75.3%. Oxygen tank number 2 temperature begins to rise rapidly. Flow rate of oxygen to all 3 fuel cells begins to decrease.
preventing something.
Oxygen tank number 2 pressure reaches maximum value.
Into space.
Okay, let's everybody think of the kind of things we'd be...
Oxygen tank number 2 quantity jumps to off-scale high and then begins to drop until telemetry loss, indicating fail sensor. All this within 1 minute of Swigert's alert to ground control, Houston, we have a problem.
Okay, let's start scanning.
News agencies begin to break the story, and the world becomes aware that Houston has a problem, and that a serious malfunction could jeopardize the lunar landing. Back in the Mission Control Center, engineers observe further developments aboard Apollo 13. Stabilization control system rate changes begin, and now the pressure in oxygen tank number 1 drops. The master caution and warning alarm is triggered, but turned off in 6 seconds. All indications are that the cryogenic oxygen tank number 2 lost pressure in this time period and the panel separated. Nitrogen pressure in fuel cell 1 is off-scale low, indicated a fail sensor. On the positive side, telemetry is recovered, but the service propulsion system engine valve body temperature begins to rise. The total fuel cell current is 15 amps higher than the final value before telemetry loss. High current continues for 19 seconds. Oxygen tank number 2 pressure reads off-scale low following telemetry recovery, indicating a broken supply line or a fail sensor. Oxygen tank number 1 pressure begins to drop. Oxygen flow rates to fuel cells 1 and 3 approach 0 after decreasing for 7 seconds. The surface temperature of the service module oxidizer tank in Bay 3 begins to increase, as does the service propulsion system helium tank temperature.
I've got a feeling we've lost 2 fuel cells.
The master caution and warning alarm is triggered again by a high hydrogen flow rate to fuel cell 2.
It doesn't all tag up.
Back on the ground, space engineers were desperately trying to determine the exact cause of the accident and what effect it would have for the continued flight of the mission. Others were assessing the time frame open to them as they endeavored to make a practical decision.
I'll tell you what, GNC, can you get somebody in the back room to try to figure out what the equivalent delta V is we're getting so that we can see if we can backtrack to see if we can figure out what's venting? Raj, we'll give it a try, Flight. Okay?
Aware that, of 2 oxygen tanks, one was displaying 0 content and the other was rapidly decreasing, the Apollo 13 crew came to the conclusion that, in Lovell's words, they were indeed in serious trouble. They were coming to the decision that the only way they could survive was to transfer to the LEM, the lunar module. Ground control began to share that view as the realization dawned that this was as serious a situation that NASA had ever had to face. The astronauts transferred to the lunar module under instructions to preserve what power they could. The accident had occurred 200,000 miles from Earth. Lovell, Swigert and Hayes were now riding in a lunar module attached to a lifeless command module. Apollo 13 had started as a mission of scientific exploration, but was now a matter of survival. Since the command module was effectively dead, except for the oxygen and power hoarded for re-entry, the guidance platform of Aquarius, designed to land on and take off from the Moon, would have to be brought into play. Crucial to this plan, though, was to get a correct alignment with the LEM platform. Without knowing exactly which way the attitude of the spacecraft was, it was virtually impossible to know how to ignite the engines of that spacecraft to get the proper trajectory to come home. To get into the correct orbit around the Moon, the crew had burned out of a trajectory that would have automatically brought them back to Earth. They would have to find a way to get back on a safe course toward Earth. The stricken astronauts were required to perform a manual burn, a 3-man operation in which Swigert handled the timing of the ignition and when to stop it. Hayes' responsibility was the pitch maneuver, and Lovell looked after the roll maneuver, as well as physically operating the switch to stop the engines. It was a tense moment on the ground as Mission Control authorized the crew to go for the burn. With a sigh of relief, the engineers heard the mission controller's word, "You're looking good." And when Lovell confirmed the auto shutdown, the first problem was solved. Lovell, Swigert and Hayes were back on the path to Earth. But there were many other problems to be solved. From a building at Houston's Manned Spacecraft Center, systems experts coordinated the coast-to-coast effort to get the crew back. One of the big problems was consumables. There would be enough to eat and drink, but in space there were other factors: oxygen to breathe, electrical power to keep the spacecraft alive, water to cool the equipment and keep it operating. For the time being, the ground crew was confident that everything was under control and the rescue mission was on track.
Hey, I want to say you guys are doing real good work.
Apollo 13's orbit would now take them behind the moon. But before that occurred, a key decision had to be made: where to bring them down. Their present course would take them to the Indian Ocean, where recovery would be difficult. A burn to bring them home quicker would take them to the Pacific Ocean and nearer to recovery forces. Bringing them home even faster would place them in the South Atlantic, again away from recovery forces. It was decided to take them to the Pacific. Apollo 13 passed within 137 miles of the moon. For Lovell, it was the second time he'd been so close to the target destination, but there was no time for contemplation. There was another critical burn coming. As the distant voices crackled across the airwaves to Houston, the world's press gathered to tell the story. Shortly after Apollo 13 had separated from the Saturn third stage, the stage had been sent on a trajectory toward the moon. Its impact would be recorded by the seismometer left by Apollo 12. The impact was successfully recorded, the ground-based scientists telling the astronauts that the force of the impact appeared to be substantial. "I'm glad we didn't have a LEM impact too," was the wry reply from Apollo 13. To conserve the electric power and cooling water, the crew shut down all but the vital life-sustaining systems of the LEM. Flight Director Eugene Kranz was now cautiously confident that the lunar module was fully capable of getting the crew back. As he pointed out to newsmen at the time, the module, or LEM as the world quickly began to know it, had always done more in tests than was expected of it, and now that performance record was good news for the safe return of the astronauts. On board, not everything went entirely to plan. The water gun was leaking, and although it was quickly shut off, Lovell estimated it had lost about a quart of water. Later, the mission commander observed that it took him about 2 days to get his feet dry. The crew then faced another problem: their own exhale breath. The lithium hydroxide chemical to take carbon dioxide out of the air was not sufficient in the lunar module. Ground engineers improvised and discovered that the canisters from the command module could be adapted to fit the hoses in the LEM. On the ground, an adapter was fashioned from materials that the engineers knew would be available to the crew aboard the LEM: cardboard, plastic bags and tape. After checking out the effectiveness of the instant invention, construction details were sent up to Aquarius. The astronauts were able to put together 2 of the makeshift devices, and within an hour they noted a marked decrease in carbon dioxide. After a small burn to correct the course of their trajectory, the crew jettisoned the damaged service module. As the module floated away, the astronauts were amazed to see that a whole side of the module appeared to have been blown away. Now it was time to clamber back into Odyssey to jettison Aquarius prior to re-entry back into the atmosphere. Lovell's emotional words were heard in mission control. "Farewell, Aquarius, and thank you." Lovell, Swigert and Hayes were now on the final leg of their life-threatening journey. But to add to their difficulties, they were all exhausted, relying more and more on the support, both technical and mental, of the ground crew. All the while, the world came to a standstill to watch this human drama unfold. From the first news of the accident through to the final tense moments of the re-entry blackout and the worries about the effectiveness of the heat shield, people all over the world followed the story on radio, television and papers. For 4 days, it seemed everyone watched and waited to see if the crew would make it back safely. The tension in Houston was palpable during the re-entry blackout. And then the staccato voices of the astronauts was followed by a visual sighting on the giant TV screen in the Mission Control Center, as the ground staff stood as one to applaud the return of the 3 spacemen. On the 17th of April 1970, at 7 minutes and 44 seconds past midday Central Standard Time, the crew of Apollo 13 splashed down only 4 miles from the prime recovery ship, the USS Iwo Jima. The astronauts' relief was shared by anxious viewers the world over, with tears shed and spontaneous applause breaking out wherever the splashdown could be seen. The world's press rushed into print to spread the good news. But now, for space engineers, it was time to determine the cause of the accident. It was 2 months before NASA was satisfied that the reasons were understood. The accident began, in fact, in 1965, when the design engineers decided to change the spacecraft power supplies from 28 to 65 volts. Normally, of course, such a change would cause a cascade of other changes, as designers adapted their particular components to the new operating environment. However, the people building the innards of the service module oxygen tanks somehow never became consciously aware of the change. Each of the tanks carried a stirring fan, a heating element, and a temperature-sensitive switch designed to shut everything off if the element got hotter than about 25 degrees centigrade. And none of these components was ever redesigned to accommodate the higher voltage. But with the safe return of the astronauts, the faces at Houston that had been creased for days with tension were now creased with smiles. Lovell, Swigert and Hayes were accorded a hero's welcome, with President Nixon one of the first on the telephone to congratulate them. Nixon went on to say that, while some may claim the aborted flight to have been unsuccessful, he would declare it a successful mission. From the start, the President pointed out the exploration of space has been a hazardous adventure, and the voyage of Apollo 13 had dramatized its risks. But he told the astronauts their mission had served their country. It had served to remind everyone of the proud heritage of their nation, to remind all that in this age of technicians and scientific marvels, that the individual still counts, and that in a crisis, the character of a man or of men and women will make the difference.
Will make the difference.